gospel lesson comes from the 19th chapter of Luke, beginning in the first verse. Listen for the word of God. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. He was trying to see Jesus, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree because he knew Jesus was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry, come down, for I must stay at your house today." So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. Now all who saw it began to grumble and said, "Jesus has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Then Jesus said to him, "Today, salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." Thus ends our reading. May God bless our hearing of the word.
Thanks be to God.
Before I talk about the gospel story we just heard, I want to do a little what I did on vacation recounting. As you know, I went to Ireland with my family to visit Bobby, who's living in Belfast. It was really wonderful to have such intimate time with my family. It's rare to get occasion to be like that. And we saw some exquisitely beautiful countryside. But I also was struck by this opportunity to learn about a history I didn't know that much about, the conflicts that have divided Northern Ireland literally for centuries between Catholics and Protestants. And it's really not about religion, it's about a cultural identity that dates back centuries. And the worst part of it was fairly recently in what was known as the Troubles, a period that lasted from the 60s up until the Good Friday Peace Accord was signed in 1998. And during those years, 3,500 people plus were killed by violence, sectarian violence. And since Northern Ireland is a small country, if that proportion of people died in our country, it would be like 650,000 people. So everybody knew somebody who had died in the conflict. It's gotten a lot better. There hasn't been any of that kind of violence in a long time, I'm glad to say, particularly with my son there. It's actually a fairly peaceful city, but you drive around town and there's all these reminders, these murals of reminders of the paramilitary troops that fought on behalf of either the Protestants or the Catholics. Men dressed in black holding guns. These are on murals that you come across different neighborhoods clearly marked by their murals. And there is still a strong sense of that divide, though it's gotten better. There's this joke we heard about an Irish person who came overseas and then went back to live in Northern Ireland and found himself in a neighborhood, an unfamiliar neighborhood, and was suddenly surrounded by some young thugs who asked, "All right, are you a Protestant or are you a Catholic?" And not wanting to get stuck in the middle of it, he said, "I'm a Jew." And that took him back a little bit until he said, "Well, are you a Protestant Jew or a Catholic Jew?" Which gives you something of how this abides. It's a lot better, but it's going to take a good while for this to be left behind because of that capacity of we human beings to see people in terms of labels and not to see them as individuals. And one of the places where it's healing is taking place is sports. And Bobby's team is in a Protestant town, but it's got Catholic players. And one of Bobby's best friends I met, he spent 7 years in prison during the Troubles as a part of the IRA. But he's a wonderful guy. So, I'm going to set that aside and come back to it in a wee little bit. Did you catch that? Heard that word a lot in here. And I want to talk about this story of Zacchaeus, the wee little man. If you remember the Sunday school song, it's always been one of my favorites. And there are certain parts of it that are fairly clear. What we know is that Jesus has been spending, for a good portion of the Gospel of Luke, he has been making his way to the city of Jerusalem where he will lay down his life for all people. And as he approaches Jerusalem, he comes to the town of Jericho, and this great crowd of people surround him as he's passing through the city. And as he comes to a certain point, he sees this rich tax collector up in a tree, and he invites himself over to his house to eat. And the whole town is upset because he's a notorious sinner. And this isn't the first time this happens in the Gospel of Luke, that Jesus upsets people for his willingness to be in such close fellowship with people considered sinners. And I have always interpreted this story. I have an interpretation of this story that I'm very fond of. And I'm going to briefly go over that. And in this interpretation, Zacchaeus is a pretty despicable guy. He has become a tax collector, which means that he is in a contract with the Roman oppressors who, because of emperor's orders, are taxing these poor and oppressed people. And so he's despised in that position, and he's rich. And elsewhere in the Gospel of Luke, there's lots of warnings of the dangers of spiritual dangers of wealth. And he has gotten rich in this position, and the position would have offered him lots of opportunity to cheat people and get all the richer, and that's what he's been doing. And so he's despised. And I like to imagine him, though, finding himself in this place of loneliness and isolation and wondering how he got there. And he's helpless, though, to go back and change the choices he's made in his life. And he's helpless to let go of this resentment, because once he took that position of the tax collector, and he probably had justification. Somebody's got to take this job, or else the Romans are going to come swooping in with their violence, so I might as well do it. I'm good with numbers. And he took the job, and then his people began to resent him and isolate him, and as their hearts were hardened toward him, he hardened his heart back, and he's in this place of utter isolation. And then Jesus comes along, and with this incredible, surprising bolt of divine grace, this unexpected, powerful love, Zacchaeus is transformed from being this man stuck in this self-centeredness to being concerned about his community. And then Jesus declares, "This man is a son of Abraham," by which he's saying, he's a member of your community, take him back in spite of the fact that they don't want you to take him. Interesting little side effect here. We are blessed this morning by our Muslim friends who are also children of Abraham. Interesting little part of the story that connects with our friends who have visited us today. So that's the usual interpretation I have of this story, and I like it. I like I like the divine grace that melts the heart of Zacchaeus and allows him to begin to be this gracious, generous saint. But I read an interpretation this week that suggested that perhaps I've gotten the story completely wrong. I like the interpretation. I'm not going to give it up. I think it's okay to have different takes on a story. But the reason for this is it all has to do with two verbs that come in verse 8. And they are translated different ways. And in the version that Fred read for us this morning is perhaps the most common way. It involves whether the verb is in the present tense or the future tense. And so when Zacchaeus says, half of my possessions I give to the poor, it's often translated, will be given to the poor, as it was in that translation. And if I've defrauded anybody, I will make it over 4 times. There is a good argument that this is a present tense verb. And if that's the case, the entire meaning of the passage changes. What it means is Zacchaeus isn't talking about what he's going to be doing from this point forward. He's talking about what he's already been doing. He's already been giving half of his possessions away to the poor. He's already been making right 4 times over any time it's called to his attention that he defrauded somebody. It puts a totally different light on the story. It's not so much about the power of God's grace to transform this guy. It's about a community that could not see what Jesus saw in terms of the goodness of this man. And then it begins to remind us of the conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics, and the conflicts we have in this country between the inability to see people past the labels. It's the inability of the people there of Jericho to recognize in this man they so badly wanted to see as despicable was in fact had some really good parts to him, very generous parts to him. That's a message for us, particularly on All Saints Sunday. There's this basic difference between how Catholics and Protestants, this has nothing to do with the Ireland conflict, but this theological difference about how we view saints. Catholics see saints as this very select few people who reach a level of holiness beyond the rest of us, and they get this special designation of being a saint. And there's a value to that because it calls forth these remarkable people who we can aspire to be like. But that's not really how the word is used in the New Testament, and Protestants traditionally follow how it's used there, which is to say that a saint is anybody who's a part of the community of faith that has been drawn together by Jesus, that we are all saints. There's a story I heard about Mother Teresa, who actually reached sainthood after her death. And she arrives in an airport, and an obnoxious reporter keeps badgering her, "Mother Teresa, are you a saint?" And finally she says, "Yes, and so are you." That to be a saint is to be in the grace of God, and that means we are very frail saints. We are saints who have the capacity for profound goodness and the capacity for cruelty and penitence, and it's in all of us. But the thing about this story, if this other interpretation is right, is that Jesus had the capacity to see the goodness in Zacchaeus, which everybody else was blind to. And he was able to name it and call it forth. And what might that mean for you and me, to be able to see the goodness in other people, maybe particularly the goodness in people that for whatever prejudice we carry with us, we don't want to see. To name it and nurture it. And to know that that's what God is calling us towards. That none of us are finished products. That God is at work in our life, and when we get into the glorious light and love that is God's heaven, that all that is within us that blocks the light and the love, which all of us struggle with, that's all going to fall away because the love is going to be so overwhelming, and we will become that shining saint who can love even better than we love now. That's where we're headed. us be gentle with one another. On the streets of Belfast, I came across a mural amongst all those other murals that had my favorite quote up on a wall. Be kind to everyone you meet, because everybody is fighting a great battle of which you know nothing. And to see inside of everybody that there is a struggle going on between goodness and evil, between light and darkness, and that the light really is there, and that we can name and encourage that light. And it's important to see it like Jesus saw it in Zacchaeus, and the community couldn't see it. And to give thanks for that, what God is doing in the lives of each of us in a long, awkward journey often to bring forth the light in this extraordinary width and depth and breadth. Please pray with me. Thank you, O God, for all the saints who bless us in all their frailties and all their imperfections. It is their love that shines forth now as we remember them. They've gone before us to the far side, but they love us still. Help us as we continue on the journey here on earth to encourage one another, to love one another as Jesus has loved us, to call forth that